Do you know the case of DeJuan Sims? He was a young child in Michigan who went missing while Christmas shopping with his mother. Or so she claimed. Upon viewing the mall's surveillance footage, the police learned that DeJuan was never in the mall that day. His mom came under suspicion from that point. In this episode of True Crime Black, we look at a case that is nearly identical. What happened to Lenoria Jones? At around 9:40 a.m. on Thursday, July 20, 1995, Berlean Williams, a 45-year-old woman, dialed 911. Speaking in a calm and composed manner, she informed the dispatcher that her niece and adopted daughter, a 3-year-old girl named Lenoria Jones, was nowhere to be found. A partial transcript of the audio recording reads, "Yes, I'm calling to see, how long is it? I mean, I just missed my daughter. She's 3 years old and I'm here in the grocery store. I was walking around trying to find her, but I haven't seen her yet." Following the distress call, a substantial number of police officers and volunteers descended upon the Hilltop neighborhood of Tacoma, Washington to search for 3-year-old Lenoria Jones. The focal point of their efforts was the nearby Target store. Despite their exhaustive search that lasted several hours on that fateful Thursday, they found no trace of the missing girl. It was as though she had vanished without a trace. Naturally, the authorities turned their attention to the person who reported Lenoria missing, her great-aunt Berlean Williams. However, rather than providing clarity, the questioning of Berlean only deepened the mystery, raising more questions than answers. This peculiar turn of events transformed the case into one of the most extraordinary and enigmatic incidents in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Each attempt to move forward seemed to result in setbacks, leaving investigators with a frustrating investigation that remains unsolved to this very day. This is the case of Lenoria Jones. Lenoria Jones was born on January 3, 1992, in Spokane, Washington. From birth, her life was a struggle. Due to the presence of cocaine in her system, Lenoria was already battling a troubled beginning. She was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at a very young age. Typically, the usual practice for doctors is diagnosing it much later in childhood, usually around the age of 7. However, children born with cocaine exposure often receive an early diagnosis. This led to Lenoria being medicated for the majority of her young life. Right from the start, Lenoria's relationship with her parents seemed tenuous at best. The identity of her father remains unknown to this day, at least in the public realm. While Lenoria had some familiarity with her mother, Deidre Jones, they were not particularly close and never lived in the same house. According to the Washington Department of Social and Health Services, Lenoria's biological mother battled cocaine addiction. In the months preceding Lenoria's birth, her mother was grappling with multiple charges related to cocaine transportation. At the time of giving birth, Deidre was facing the possibility of spending several years in jail, but she luckily received an accelerated sentence of 1 year in jail and 18 months of community supervision. It is possible that this decision was made with the intention of giving Deidre an opportunity to get herself clean and assume a maternal role for her newborn daughter. Deidre didn't seem to think the same way. Shortly after Lenoria's arrival, Deidre relinquished her parental rights to Lenoria. It is unclear whether or not the state's Child and Family Services was involved in that decision. Deidre Jones subsequently abandoned the responsibility of her community supervision and relocated from Spokane to Arkansas, where she would reside for at least the next few years. Meanwhile, Lenoria, having been removed from her mother's care at birth, became a ward of the state. Over the following couple of years, she would experience placements within the foster system, staying with various relatives, including 2 aunts, 2 great-aunts, and her maternal grandparents. Nevertheless, Lenoria would eventually discover a place she could consider as her home. During the summer of 1994, Lenoria found a new home with her great-aunt, Berlean Williams, who was technically the sister of Lenoria's mother. Berlean had spent her formative years in a devoutly religious household in Mississippi, but later relocated to Washington in her early adulthood. Initially, she resided with her brother, Frank, and his wife, Annie Jones, in Spokane. Frank and Annie were the parents of Lenoria's mother, Deidre. Berlean eventually married and established her own household, welcoming the arrival of 3 daughters in quick succession: Natasha, Narissa, and Ulisa Johnson. Afterward, Berlean went through a divorce and relocated to Tacoma on the western side of the state. There, she married again and gave birth to her 4th child, Maurice Williams, who happened to be her only son. Around the time of Lenoria Jones's birth in 1992, Berlean resided in Tacoma, specifically in the neighborhood of Hilltop, which held significant recognition among Western Washington residents. Historically a predominantly black neighborhood, Hilltop has experienced considerable racial diversity in recent decades. However, it was once notorious for its high levels of gang violence. The presence of the Hilltop Crips, one of North America's most violent gangs during the 1980s, dominated the streets and facilitated drug trafficking throughout Hilltop and its surrounding areas. This reputation preceded the neighborhood, but its notoriety was further amplified by an infamous shootout in 1989 involving Army Rangers. Although hundreds of rounds were discharged during the incident, fortunately, no serious injuries or fatalities occurred. The incident triggered a significant crackdown on criminal activities. Pierce County and the state of Washington intensified their focus on Hilltop, taking stringent measures not only against the Hilltop Crips but also targeting other gangs, as well as less organized criminal networks and individuals. A heightened police presence was established throughout Hilltop, gradually pushing back against the rising tide of gangs and drugs. But this process proved to be slow and arduous, spanning several years. During this period, Berlean resided in Hilltop on the 1900 block of South Sheridan Avenue. She not only lived with her family, but she also operated a daycare center from her home. Berlean's affinity for working with children served as an asset when Lenoria moved into her home in July of 1994. Immediately upon welcoming her newly adopted daughter, Berlean initiated the process of obtaining custody. From that point forward, she assumed the role of a mother figure for Lenoria. As Lenoria continued to mature, it became evident that she was a lively and energetic child, gradually developing her unique personality under Berlean's care. Shortly after this, though, tragedy would strike before Berlean even got the official custody papers in the mail. At 9:42 a.m., on the morning of Thursday, July 20, 1995, Berlean dialed 911 to report the disappearance of Lenoria during their visit to a Target store that was approximately 2 miles away from their residence. According to Berlean's account to both the 911 dispatcher and the responding officers, she and Lenoria had been inside Target shopping together. While they were browsing the toy section, Lenoria somehow went missing. Initially, it was believed that Lenoria, being a hyperactive child, had wandered off. An extensive search conducted by the police within the Target store and its surroundings yielded no signs of the young girl. Lenoria, who had her hair braided and was last seen wearing a black Barney t-shirt and turquoise pants, seemed to have vanished without a trace. To gather potential evidence or clues about Lenoria's whereabouts or the direction she might have taken, the authorities decided to review the surveillance footage from the Target store. During the examination of the tapes, they made a startling discovery that contradicted the information initially provided. As was previously stated, Berlean told the responding officers that she was with Lenoria in Target before she disappeared. The surveillance footage revealed that Berlean had entered the store alone, without Lenoria by her side. As the police continued to comb over the footage, they saw that Lenoria did not appear on the surveillance tapes at any point throughout that day. At this point, the investigators began to suspect that Berlean had done something foul. They began an extensive round of questioning with her that only brought about more questions and frustration. She was confronted with the fact that the video showed Lenoria wasn't with her at the store. Her statement was, "Well, maybe she wasn't with me," said Jim Matthees, the spokesman for the Tacoma Police Department. "That's the kind of sketchy information we're getting. We've been unable to substantiate her story. Her story has continuously changed. These are really suspicious circumstances. It could be that the girl wandered off, but there's also a good possibility she met with foul play, he said. On that day, search and rescue teams swiftly assembled near the vicinity where Lenoria was last seen. Simultaneously, the police conducted a thorough search of Berlean's residence in the Hilltop neighborhood. Despite their efforts, no compelling evidence or any clues regarding Lenoria's current location were discovered during the search of Berlean's home. During the police investigation, as Berlean was being questioned, officers also interviewed her daughters who resided in the same household with Berlean and Lenoria. Unfortunately, the daughters who were present at home on that morning couldn't provide substantial information. However, through conversations with Berlean's daughters, the police uncovered an intriguing detail. It was revealed that Berlean had actually called one of her daughters at around 8:47 a.m. on that morning. During this conversation, Berlean told her that Lenoria was missing. The circumstances surrounding this inconsistent timeline raised doubts and uncertainties. For the police, it created a puzzling aspect of the case where they could not get an established timeline of events leading up to when Lenoria disappeared. That confusion would linger for weeks as the police continued their missing persons investigation. Around 100 individuals actively participated in the search and rescue operation that afternoon, extensively combing the area surrounding the Target store where Lenoria was reported missing. There was no trace of Lenoria to be found anywhere. The following day, Berlean was summoned for further questioning, which took place from approximately 11 a.m. until 9 p.m. During this extended interrogation, Berlean's account appeared to change once again, causing confusion and frustration among the police investigators. Tacoma Police spokesman Jim Matthews addressed the press that evening and dropped a crucial detail about Berlean's questioning. According to Matthews, Berlean revealed that she knew the whereabouts of Lenoria but was unable to disclose any details beyond that admission. Throughout the weekend, the police diligently continued their efforts on the case, but unfortunately, they were unable to uncover any clues or leads regarding the whereabouts of the missing 3-year-old. Then, on the evening of Sunday, July 23, 1995, Lenoria's family decided to address the public for the first time. They organized a small press conference held in front of Berlean's residence in the Hilltop neighborhood. Berlean herself chose to remain in the background, allowing other family members to step forward and represent her and Lenoria's family during the conference. Berlean's daughters, acting as spokespersons, stood up to defend their mother. They explained to the press that Berlean's inconsistent statements were a result of her deep concern and worry for her missing niece. They further clarified that during the intense questioning sessions with investigators, Berlean had been overwhelmed with nervousness. It was important to note that the relationship between the predominantly black community of Hilltop and the police in Tacoma had been marked by adversity and tension. Given these circumstances, Berlean's daughters believed that their mother's anxiety and apprehension during the police investigation were understandable reactions in the context of the community's history with law enforcement. In addition to defending Berlean, Lenoria's family members publicly asserted that the young girl had been abducted. Lenoria Johnson, one of Berlean's daughters, provided her account of the events at Target. According to Lenoria, Lenoria had accompanied Berlean to the store. Lenoria expressed her desire for a toy, and Berlean told her that they would first do some shopping for bathing suits before going to get the toy. At some point during their visit, Lenoria was no longer by Berlean's side. Lenoria claimed that Berlean immediately began searching for her missing niece and contacted family members shortly thereafter. When she still couldn't find her, Berlean then placed a call to 911. During the press conference, Berlean voluntarily offered to undergo another interview with the police, making it the third time she would be questioned. Law enforcement officials confirmed their intention to interview Berlean once again and expressed their plan to interview and re-interview other members of her family. The family members concluded the conference by making a heartfelt plea to the public for assistance in locating Lenoria, who had been missing for over 3 days at that point. During the initial stages of the investigation, a prominent theory discussed by both the police and the media was the possibility of a family member being involved in Lenoria's abduction. The fact that Berlean's custody of the girl was being contested at the time of her disappearance fueled this speculation, leading to the suggestion that a disgruntled family member may have taken matters into their own hands. Law enforcement initially tried to locate Lenoria's biological mother, who they believed resided in Texas. It was later discovered that she actually lived in Arkansas, prompting investigators to reach out to the police in Star City to make contact with her. Lenoria's mother, Lenoria Jones, had spent a year in jail following her daughter's birth and subsequently completed 18 months of community supervision in the Spokane area. Then, during this time, Lenoria vanished and failed to comply with the necessary reporting requirements, resulting in an arrest warrant being issued for her in Washington. Ultimately, she ended up in Star City, Arkansas, where she was residing at the time of Lenoria's disappearance. Local police conducted an investigation at Lenoria's residence but found no evidence linking her to Lenoria's whereabouts. The FBI also participated in the case, conducting interviews with Lenoria, her relatives, and acquaintances in the area. Based on the evidence available, the agents did not believe that Lenoria was involved in Lenoria's disappearance, nor did they find any indication that the incident was related to a custody dispute. Publicly, Mathis and other police officials began to speculate about the possibility that Lenoria had overdosed on the medication prescribed to treat her ADHD, specifically desipramine. Desipramine was a tricyclic antidepressant commonly used to manage ADHD symptoms. It is presumed that this medication was chosen to address Lenoria's ADHD, potentially due to its potential benefits for cocaine-exposed individuals. Reports indicated that Lenoria had only been taking this medication for a few days leading up to her disappearance, having received the prescription approximately a week prior to her disappearance. From the outset, a theory has persisted in this case, largely fueled by police officials discussing it in the media, suggesting that Lenoria's great-aunt may have been aware of what happened to her. This notion emerged immediately, within the first hour of Lenoria's disappearance. Law enforcement officials maintain that Berlean Williams' 911 call reporting Lenoria missing conveyed a sense of indifference. Apart from Berlean's tone, which we can only rely on the account of the Tacoma Police Department, investigators assert that the call itself contained significant inconsistencies. For instance, the 911 call was placed approximately 30 minutes after Berlean arrived at Target, around 9:42 a.m. Throughout the call, she appeared uncertain about the duration of Lenoria's absence, stating at one point, "I think just a few minutes," and shortly after, about 10 or 15 minutes. Despite their strong belief that she was involved, Berlean has never been charged with a crime in relation to Lenoria's disappearance. Then, during the spring of 1996, investigators turned their attention to Lenoria's maternal grandparents, Frank and Annie Jones, who resided in Spokane. As a reminder, Frank and Annie were Berlean's brother and sister-in-law, and their daughter, Lenoria, was Lenoria's mother. Prior to Lenoria's disappearance, Frank and Annie had been engaged in a custody battle for her and had been outspoken in urging the police to charge Berlean with something, suspecting that she was withholding information from the investigation. In this new round of questioning, investigators traveled to Spokane to conduct further interviews with the Joneses, who had already been previously interviewed. They were also asked to undergo polygraph tests. Although authorities maintained that they were simply wrapping up another round of interviews in their efforts to reignite the investigation, many perceived it as a repetitive exercise, repeating the same steps with hopes of a different outcome. Subsequently, media coverage of Lenoria, Berlean, and those connected to their lives seemed to dwindle. As the one-year mark since Lenoria's disappearance approached, public interest in the story of a missing black girl from Hilltop, Washington was just not a priority. Lenoria's case faded into the background, only occasionally mentioned in passing or as a reference to another event. To this day, we still have no idea what happened to her.